I never expected to inherit a bed and breakfast at age 62. The lawyer's call came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was watering the potted geraniums on my apartment balcony in Chicago. Miss Katherine Reynolds, I'm calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Bennett. Aunt Eleanor, my mother's sister, whom I hadn't seen in over 30 years, not since that summer when everything changed. Ms. Reynolds, are you there? Yes, sorry, I said, setting down the watering can. Did you say Aunt Eleanor passed away? 3 weeks ago, peacefully, according to her doctor. She left explicit instructions regarding her estate. The Sea Cliff Inn in Oceanside, Maine, along with all its contents and property, has been bequeathed to you. I nearly dropped the phone. The Sea Cliff Inn. Just hearing the name transported me back. The scent of salt air, the sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore, and the feeling of first love that had blossomed and withered there in a single summer. There must be some mistake, I said. Eleanor and we weren't close. Nevertheless, you are the sole beneficiary. The inn has been closed since Ms. Bennett became ill 6 months ago. According to her will, you may sell it or operate it as you see fit. My mind raced. I had retired from teaching high school English just last year. My husband Robert had passed away 5 years earlier. My son lived across the country with his wife and children. There was nothing tying me to Chicago except habit and the fear of change. Is there a time limit, I asked, for deciding what to do with it? No, but the property taxes will be due in September. Perhaps you could visit Oceanside, see the property, and then make your decision. That's how 1 week later, I found myself driving down the winding coastal road that led to the Sea Cliff Inn, a place I had tried so hard to forget. As I rounded the final curve, the Victorian mansion came into view, perched majestically on the bluff overlooking the Atlantic. Its weathered blue paint had faded, and the white trim needed attention. But it was still beautiful, hauntingly so. I parked in the empty lot and sat for a moment, gathering courage. Why had Eleanor left this place to me? We had barely spoken after that summer of 1978. The summer I met James. The summer everything fell apart. The key felt heavy in my hand as I approached the front door. A sign hung in the window. Closed until further notice. Taking a deep breath, I turned the key and stepped inside. The lobby was just as I remembered. The antique reception desk, the grandfather clock that had never kept proper time, the painting of Oceanside Harbor above the fireplace. The air smelled of lemon polish and something else. Memories, perhaps. On the desk sat a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Eleanor's elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Dear Katherine, if you're reading this, I've finally run out of time. I've hoped for years that you would return to Sea Cliff, but I understand why you couldn't. There are things you don't know, truths that have remained hidden for too long. Start in room 8. That's where the answers begin. With love and regret, Eleanor. Room 8. My heart began to race. That had been my room during that fateful summer when I worked as a housekeeper at the inn. The room where James had first kissed me, where we had planned our future, where we had said our final goodbye. I climbed the creaking stairs slowly, trailing my fingers along a polished banister. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, the numbered doors leading to the guest rooms exactly as I remembered. At the end of the hall was room 8. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the master key in the lock. The door swung open to reveal a room frozen in time. The same 4-poster bed with its patchwork quilt. The same writing desk beneath the window overlooking the ocean. The same worn armchair in the corner. But there was something new on the wall opposite the bed. A painting. A portrait of a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes, looking out at the viewer with a mixture of hope and sadness. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. Me at 22. and in the corner of the canvas was a signature I recognized immediately. James Sullivan, 1978. Chapter 2. The First Discovery. I stood transfixed before the portrait, my heart pounding against my ribs. The brushstrokes were unmistakably James's, bold, passionate, capturing not just my appearance, but something of my spirit as well. He had painted me looking out to sea, my hair tousled by the wind, a slight smile playing at my lips. It was how I looked the day we met, when I had been sitting on the cliffs sketching the lighthouse. But how had this painting come to be here? James had left Oceanside at the end of that summer, heading to New York to pursue his art career. We had agreed to go our separate ways, his art in the city, my teaching position back home. We were too young, too focused on our futures to make it work. At least, that's what I had told myself all these years. I moved closer to examine the painting. There, tucked into the frame, was a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, I extracted it and unfolded a letter dated September 5th, 1978, 1 week after I had left Oceanside. Dearest Kat, I've called your home number every day since you left, but your mother says you don't want to speak to me. I can't believe that's true after everything we shared. Please call me at Eleanor's. I'm staying on through September, finishing a commission. We need to talk. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. All my love, James. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter clutched in my hand. What misunderstanding? I had never received any calls. After returning home to Chicago, I had waited by the phone for days, but James never called. Eventually, I had packed away my broken heart and moved forward with my life, accepting a teaching job, meeting Robert, building a different kind of life than the one I had dreamed of with James. Had my mother lied to me? She had never approved of James, calling him a penniless artist and insisting I could do better. But to intercept his calls? To deliberately keep us apart? It seemed unimaginable, yet the letter in my hand suggested otherwise. I returned to the painting, studying it more carefully. Now I noticed details I had missed, the pendant around my neck that James had given me, the lighthouse in the background where we had first kissed, and most tellingly, the small letter I appeared to be holding in my hand. He had captured not just my image, but our story. As I stepped back, my heel caught on a loose floorboard. I knelt down to examine it and found that it shifted easily under pressure. A hiding place? Curiosity overcoming me, I pried up the board and reached into the dark space beneath. My fingers closed around a small box, which I carefully pulled out. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, all addressed to me in James's handwriting, all with my Chicago address, all stamped "Return to Sender" in my mother's distinctive script. I untied the ribbon with shaking hands and began to read. Letter after letter, James poured out his heart, his love for me, his confusion over my silence, his decision to stay in Oceanside and work with Eleanor to build his art career locally rather than go to New York. The final letter, dated Christmas 1978, simply said, "Kat, I won't write again after this. Your silence has spoken louder than words ever could. I'll always love you, but I have to let you go. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. J." Tears streamed down my face as 40 years of misunderstanding crashed down around me. My mother had intercepted his calls. She had returned his letters, and I, believing he had forgotten me, had married Robert the following year, a kind, stable man who gave me a good life, if not the passionate love I had known that summer. But why had Eleanor kept these letters, and why had she never told me James had stayed in Oceanside? Most importantly, where was James now? I gathered the letters and returned to the lobby, searching for clues. In Eleanor's small office behind the reception desk, I found the inn's guest registers. I flipped through them, year by year, scanning for James's name. There it was, appearing periodically, James Sullivan, Room 12. The last entry was just 7 months ago. He had been coming back to see Cliff regularly for years, staying in the same room, just down the hall from the room that held our memories. Had he been hoping to run into me all these years? Or was he simply returning to a place that had become home? I needed answers, and I knew where to start looking. Room 12, Chapter 3, The Artist's Room. Room 12 was at the opposite end of the hall from my old room, with a view of the lighthouse rather than the open sea. I hesitated outside the door, key in hand, fewer like an intruder, despite being the inn's new owner. Finally, I turned the key and stepped inside. Unlike Room 8, which had been preserved like a museum exhibit, Room 12 showed signs of regular use. A weathered leather satchel sat on the desk chair. Books lined the small shelf above the bed. Art books, poetry collections, novels I recognized as favorites from our shared summer. And on the walls hung several small paintings, all landscapes of Oceanside, the harbor at dawn, the lighthouse in a storm, the cliffs bathed in sunset light. James's work had matured beautifully over the years. The bold strokes of youth had mellowed into a more nuanced style, but the emotional resonance remained. He painted not just what the eye could see, but what the heart could feel. On the desk was a sketchbook. I shouldn't look, I told myself, even as I moved toward it. This was James's private work, but I needed to know, was he still in Oceanside? Had Eleanor's death caused him to leave, or was he planning to return? The sketchbook fell open to recent drawings, all dated within the last year. Sketches of the inn, the garden, the rocky beach below, and on the final completed page, a sketch of an older woman sitting on the porch, Eleanor, looking frail but smiling. The date in the corner was just 2 months ago. Next to the sketchbook lay a business card, Sullivan Gallery, 217 Harbor Street, Oceanside, Maine. So James had stayed. He had built his life and career here in this small coastal town, while I had been in Chicago, oblivious. I sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by what might have been, by the lives we might have lived if not for my mother's interference, by the years wasted believing James had forgotten me when he had been here all along. A knock at the inn's front door startled me from my thoughts. I hurried downstairs, wondering who would be visiting a closed bed and breakfast. Through the beveled glass of the front door, I could make out the silhouette of a man. Tall, with slightly stooped shoulders, gray hair catching the afternoon light. My heart seemed to stop, then race forward. I opened the door slowly, and there he was. James Sullivan, aged by 40 years, but unmistakably himself. The same thoughtful blue eyes, the same slight crease between his brows when he concentrated. Those eyes widened in shock when he saw me. "Katherine?" he whispered, as if afraid I might be an apparition. "Hello, James," I managed to say, though my voice wasn't entirely steady. He stood frozen on the threshold, staring at me with disbelief. "Eleanor said she promised she'd tell you if she—" His voice trailed off. "She left me the inn," I explained. "I just arrived today." "The inn?" He looked genuinely surprised. "I thought she'd just ask you to come for her things. I never imagined she'd leave you Seacliff." Did you know her plan? To bring me back here?" James shook his head slowly. "Eleanor and I had an agreement. She gave me studio space in the boathouse, and I helped maintain the inn. When she got sick, she asked me to promise not to contact you directly. She said she had to make things right herself." An uncomfortable silence fell between us, 40 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. "I found the letters," I finally said, "in room 8, and the painting." James's face reflected a complex mixture of emotions: pain, relief, lingering confusion. You never answered any of them. Not one. I never received them. My mother—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal still felt too fresh, too raw. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Didn't approve of me. No, she had different plans for my life. Another silence, less strained this time. "Would you like to come in?" I asked. "We have a lot to talk about." James nodded and stepped inside, into the lobby where we had first met when I applied for the summer housekeeping job, and he was staying as Eleanor's guest, an up-and-coming artist painting seascapes for a local gallery. As he passed me, I caught a whiff of turpentine and salt air, the scent I had always associated with him, with that summer, with first love. It was like stepping back in time, yet we were different people now, shaped by the lives we had lived apart. "I've thought about you," James said quietly, "every day for 40 years. My heart constricted. I had thought about him too, though I had tried not to. I had built a life with Robert, raised our son, found happiness in teaching. But there had always been a corner of my heart that belonged to the summer of 1978. To the young man with paint-stained hands who had shown me what it meant to love with abandon. "I got married," I said, then immediately wondered why that was the first thing I chose to tell him. "I know, Eleanor told me." "She kept tabs on you all these years." He paused. "I heard about your husband's passing. I'm sorry." "Thank you. It's been 5 years now." I hesitated. "And you, did you ever—" James shook his head. "There was someone for a while. It didn't last. My work became my life." He gestured vaguely toward the harbor. "The gallery keeps me busy." I wanted to ask if I was the reason, if waiting for me had cost him a family, children, the ordinary happiness most people find. But it wasn't a fair question, not yet. We were still strangers in many ways, despite the history between us. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, falling back on social niceties to bridge the awkwardness. "I think I saw some in the kitchen." Jane smiled, that same crooked smile that had once made my young heart somersault. "Tea would be nice. And then, if you're willing, I'd like to show you something in the boathouse, something I think Eleanor meant for you to see." Chapter 4. The Boathouse Studio. The inn's kitchen was a large, warm space with modern appliances that contrasted with the Victorian character of the rest of the building. As I prepared tea, James sat at the large wooden table, his fingers tracing patterns on its worn surface. "Eleanor upgraded this part of the inn about 10 years ago," he explained. "She loved to cook for the guests. Special breakfasts were her trademark." I nodded, remembering my aunt's famous blueberry pancakes and cinnamon rolls. She was a wonderful cook, even when I was young. The kettle whistled, and I poured hot water into the teapot. Such an ordinary action making tea for Jane Sullivan in my aunt's kitchen, yet it felt surreal. Hours ago, I had been in my Chicago apartment, believing he was a distant memory. Now here he was, aged but essentially unchanged, sitting across from me as if no time had passed. "How did you and Eleanor stay so close?" I asked, as I brought the tea to the table. "After that summer, I mean." James wrapped his hands around the mug, warming them, though the day wasn't cold. "When you left, I was devastated. I had planned to follow you to Chicago, to try to make it work somehow. But when you didn't answer my calls or letters, I assumed you'd had second thoughts." I winced, thinking of my mother's deception. "I'm so sorry, James. If I had known." He shook his head gently. "We can't change the past, Katherine. Anyway, Eleanor saw how broken I was. She offered me the boathouse to use as a studio, said I could stay until I figured out my next steps." He gave a small laugh. 40 years later, I'm still figuring." "And you've been here all this time? Never left Oceanside?" "Oh, I've traveled. Had exhibits in New York, San Francisco, even Paris once. But I always came back. Something about this place." He looked out the window toward the ocean. "The light here is different. It gets inside you." I understood. Even after all these years, I had never forgotten the way the sunlight played on the water here, the way the fog rolled in and transformed the landscape, the way the stars seemed closer over the Maine coastline than they ever did in Chicago. "Are you successful?" I asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of the question. "I mean, with your art." James smiled. "Successful enough. My work sells well to collectors who like coastal scenes. The gallery turns a profit. I've been able to live the life I wanted, making art, teaching sometimes at the local college." He paused. "It's not fame or fortune, but it's been a good life." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. "You always had such talent." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping our tea, adjusting to each other's presence. It was strange how the initial shock of seeing him was fading, replaced by a sense of quiet familiarity. "Would you like to see the boathouse now?" James finally asked, setting down his empty mug. I nodded, curious about what he wanted to show me. We walked through the back door of the inn and down a winding path that led to the water. The boathouse sat at the end of a small dock, a weathered structure that had been painted the same faded blue as the main building. James unlocked the door and stepped aside to let me enter first. The space inside took my breath away. What had once been a simple boathouse had been transformed into a light-filled studio. Large windows faced the ocean, capturing the Northern Light artist's prize. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the walls. The scent of oil paint and turpentine hung in the air. But what caught my eye was the wall directly opposite the door. It was covered with paintings, dozens of them, all of the same subject. Me. Me as I had been that summer, young and hopeful. Me as I might have looked in my 30s, 40s, 50s. Me in imagined scenes, standing on the cliffs, reading in the garden, laughing beside the lighthouse. An entire wall dedicated to a woman who had existed in his memory, aging alongside him in his imagination. "James," I whispered, overwhelmed by the sight. "All these years?" He moved to stand beside me, his eyes fixed on the paintings. "For a long time, they were just a way to process grief. I couldn't understand why you'd left the way you did, why you'd cut off all contact. Painting you was a way to keep you with me, to work through the loss." I stepped closer to examine one of the painters, a middle-aged version of myself sitting on the inn's porch, a book in my lap, looking out at the ocean. The woman in the painting had smile lines around her eyes and a few strands of gray in her hair, but her expression was serene, content. "This is how you imagined me?" I asked softly. "That one I painted when I turned 50, James explained. "I was going through a dark period, questioning my choices, wondering if I should have tried harder to find you. I painted you as I hoped you might be, at peace, happy." Tears pricked at my eyes. While I had deliberately pushed thoughts of James aside, building a life with another man, he had carried me with him all these years. "After Eleanor told me you had married, I stopped for a while," he continued. "It seems wrong somehow, but then, about 10 years ago, I started again. By then, it wasn't about warning what might have been. It was—" "What?" I prompted when he trailed off. "A conversation," he said finally, "with the part of myself that never stopped loving you. With the memory of who we were that summer." I turned to face him, really seeing the man he had become. Lines etched around his eyes and mouth spoke of laughter and sorrow. His hands, still strong but with pronounced veins and slight tremors, showed his age. His hair, once dark brown, was now steel gray. But his eyes, those perceptive blue eyes, were unchanged. "I had a good life, James," I said, feeling it was important to tell him this. "Robert was a good man, a good husband. We were happy together." James nodded. "I'm glad. I wouldn't have wanted anything less for you. But," I continued, "there were moments, watching a sunset, hearing a certain song, walking by a gallery, when I thought of you. Wondered what had become of you. If you had found success with your art." I paused. "If you ever thought of me." "Every day," he said simply. The weight of lost time hung between us. 40 years of separate lives, separate joys and sorrows. What could have been, what never was. It was too much to process, too vast to bridge in a single afternoon. Eleanor knew, I said, understanding dawning. She knew about my mother returning your letters. That's why she left me the inn. She was trying to bring us together again. James smiled sadly. That sounds like Eleanor. Always the romantic, always believing it's never too late. He glanced at the wall of paintings. She visited the studio often. Saw all of these. She would tell me stories about you. Bits and pieces she gathered from family gatherings or holiday cards. It was her way of keeping you in my life, I think. I felt a surge of gratitude toward my aunt, mixed with regret that we hadn't reconciled while she was alive. All those years wasted, so many misunderstandings. What happens now, I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. James leaned against his workbench, considering. That depends on you, Katherine. On what you want to do with the inn, with your life. It was a fair question. I had come to Oceanside expecting to settle Eleanor's affairs and return to Chicago. But now, standing in this studio filled with alternate versions of my life, I wasn't so sure about my path forward. I need time, I said honestly. This is all. I gestured at the wall of paintings, at James, at the boathouse that had been his sanctuary for 4 decades. Of course, he said. Time is something we both have now. He hesitated, then added, I'm in room 12 if you want to talk more. Or at the gallery during the day. No pressure, no expectations. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. As I turned to leave, my eye caught one final painting, partially hidden behind others. It showed 2 elderly people, clearly James and me, sitting on a bench overlooking the ocean, hands clasped between them. It was a scene from a future that had never happened. A dream of what might have been. That one, James said, following my gaze. I painted last year, after Eleanor got sick. She asked me once if I still believed in second chances. He shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. I guess I do. I didn't trust myself to speak. I simply reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, then turned and walked back to the inn, my mind swirling with possibilities I hadn't considered when I woke up that morning in Chicago. Chapter 5. The Decision. For the next week, I lived as if in 2 worlds. The present reality of sorting through Eleanor's affairs and the swirling possibilities of a future I had never imagined. During the days, I met with Eleanor's lawyer to discuss the inn's finances, spoke with the small staff who had been on leave since her illness, and explored the town that had changed yet remained essentially the same. Oceanside had become more of a tourist destination over the decades, with boutique shops and cafes lining the harbor, but it still maintained its character as a working fishing village. I visited James's gallery downtown, a bright, airy space showcasing his seascapes alongside the work of other local artists. The woman who managed it, a friendly 40-something named Diane, told me James had started the gallery 20 years ago to showcase Maine artists who might otherwise struggle to find representation. He's been a mentor to so many of us, she explained as she showed me around. Always generous with his time, his knowledge. This community wouldn't be the same without him. Evenings I spent at the inn, sorting through Eleanor's belongings, reading through guest books that told the story of Sea Cliff's history. James and I had dinner together twice, once at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor, once at the inn with takeout from the local pizza place. We talked about our lives, carefully filling in the 40-year gap between us. I told him about my teaching career, my passion for inspiring teenagers to love literature, about Robert's steady presence in my life, his death from cancer that had come too soon, about my son Michael, now a professor in California, and my 3 grandchildren whom I saw too rarely. James told me about his journey as an artist, the lean years when he'd taken odd jobs to support his painting, the gradual recognition that had allowed him to open the gallery, about the students he'd mentored, the travels that had informed his work. About his brief marriage to a fellow artist who had ultimately chosen a more high-profile career in New York, leaving him to return to Oceanside alone. Neither of us pushed for more than friendship, both aware of the delicate balance between past and present. But I couldn't deny the current that still ran between us, a connection that had been interrupted but never fully broken. On the 7th day, I woke early and walked down to the beach. The tide was out, revealing tide pools among the rocks where small crabs scuttled and sea anemones waved their tentacles in the shallow water. I remembered exploring these same tools with James that long ago summer, his artist's eye spotting beauty in the most ordinary creatures. As the sun rose higher, I made my way back to the inn, my decision crystallizing with each step. In the kitchen, I found James making coffee, moving with the ease of someone familiar with the space. "Morning," he said, offering me a mug. "Sleep well?" "Yes," I replied, accepting the coffee. "I've made a decision about the inn." He nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "And? I'm going to keep it," I said, the words feeling right as I spoke them. "Reopen it, but I'll need help." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "What kind of help?" "Well, I know nothing about running a bed and breakfast, but I know that Eleanor's special breakfasts were part of the appeal. I'm a decent cook, but not that creative. I might know someone who makes excellent blueberry pancakes," James offered, though his scones are still a work in progress. I raised an eyebrow. "You cook?" "Eleanor taught me years ago, said every bachelor should know how to make more than just coffee. We used to test recipes on off-season weekends." I smiled, imagining them in this kitchen, my aunt instructing James in her precise way. "I'll also need someone who knows the building's quirks. The plumbing, the electrical. Seacliff does have its character," James agreed. "The west side guest rooms get too warm in the afternoon, unless you keep the blinds just so. And the third stair from the top on the back staircase always creaks, no matter how many times it's fixed." "Sounds like you know this place as well as anyone." "Better than most," he admitted. "I've been helping maintain it for decades." I took a deep breath. "Then perhaps we could work together? You could keep your studio in the boathouse, help me with the inn when needed. We could see." "See what?" he prompted when I didn't finish. "If there's still something worth exploring between us," I said quietly. "If it's not too late for whatever this might become." James set down his coffee mug and turned to face me fully. "Katherine Reynolds," he said, his voice gentle. "I've been waiting 40 years to hear you say something like that. I think I can wait a bit longer while we figure it out." He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, an echo of a gesture from our shared past. "No pressure, no expectations," he reminded me. "Just possibilities." "Possibilities," I agreed. "And maybe second chances." I had come to Oceanside expecting to confront and close the door on my past. Instead, I found myself opening a new one that led not backward to what might have been, but forward to what still could be. As we stood in Eleanor's kitchen planning the inn's reopening, I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This wasn't the life I had planned, but perhaps it was the one I was meant to find, eventually. "I think Eleanor would approve," James said, glancing around the kitchen with affection. I thought of the portrait in room 8, of the wall of paintings in the boathouse, of the letter guiding me back to this place, of 40 years of separate lives that had somehow, against all odds, converged again. "Yes," I said, "I think she would." Chapter 6. The Reunion. Spring turned to summer as we worked to bring Seacliff Inn back to life. We repainted the exterior that faded blue, replaced worn carpets, updated bathrooms, and planted a riot of flowers in the gardens. Each day brought new challenges, but also new discoveries about the inn, about each other, about the people we had become. James taught me the rhythms of the inn, which rooms caught the morning light, which guests preferred privacy over interaction, how to predict when the fog would roll in, and blanket the property in mysterious beauty. I introduced new elements, a small library in the parlor stocked with my favorite books, weekly poetry readings on the porch, cooking lessons in the spacious kitchen. We worked well together, our strengths complementary. James had the practical knowledge of the property and connections throughout Oceanside, while I brought organizational skills from my years of teaching and fresh perspectives on how to modernize the inn while maintaining its character. In late June, we officially reopened. The first weekend was fully booked, many of them returning guests who had been coming to Seacliff for years and were eager to see it restored. The local paper ran a small story about the inn's new chapter, featuring a photo of James and me on the front porch, not quite touching, but standing close enough to suggest a connection. As summer progressed, we fell into a comfortable routine. James maintained his studio in the boathouse and spent mornings at his gallery in town, but joined me each afternoon to help with the inn. We ate dinner together most evenings, sometimes with guests, sometimes alone on the porch watching the sunset. Our relationship evolved slowly, carefully. The attraction that had burned so brightly in our youth had transformed into something deeper, a friendship built on shared purpose, mutual respect, and the unique bond of having known each other both in youth and in the fullness of age. We were different people than we had been at 22, shaped by the lives we had lived apart. Yet, there remained a core connection that neither time nor distance had erased. In August, my son Michael came to visit with his wife Laura and their 3 children. I had told him about James, about the history between us, but seeing us together brought a new understanding. He looks at you like he's been waiting his whole life to see you again, Michael observed one evening as we sat on the porch, watching James teach my grandchildren how to skip stones across the calm water of the cove. "We've been given a second chance," I said. "Something I never expected at my age." Michael smiled. "You deserve it, Mom. After everything with Dad, after taking care of everyone else for so long." He hesitated. "Dad would have wanted you to be happy, you know." I squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. Robert had indeed been a good man, one who had valued joy and connection above all else. He wouldn't have begrudged me this unexpected chapter. The visit was a turning point for James and me. Seeing him with my family, watching him connect with my grandchildren through art and stories, removed the last lingering doubts I had about welcoming him fully into my life. The night after my family left to return to California, James and I sat on the inn's porch, a bottle of wine between us, the sound of waves providing a gentle soundtrack to our conversation. "I've been thinking," I said, watching the moonlight play across the water, "about Route 8. James glanced at me, curious. "What about it?" "I've been using it as an office, but it seems wrong somehow. It's part of our story." I took a sip of wine, gathering courage. "I was thinking we could make it a special room, call it the Artist's Suite, hang some of your Oceanside paintings there." "Not the portraits," he said quickly, referring to the wall of paintings of me that still hung in the boathouse. "No," I agreed with a small smile. "Those can stay private, but the seascapes? The lighthouse paintings, and—" I hesitated. "I was thinking we could move the portrait of me from 1978 into our bedroom, if you're ready for that step." James set down his wine glass slowly. "Our bedroom?" "If you want," I said, suddenly uncertain. "I know we've been taking things slowly, but life is short, James. We've already lost so many years. I don't want to waste any more time." James reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, a gesture both familiar and new. "Katherine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've lived in this inn for 40 years, hoping someday you might return. I've stayed in room 12 all this time because it was as close as I could get to where we began. If you're asking me to make a home with you now, the answer is yes. It has always been yes." I felt tears well in my eyes, tears not of regret or sorrow, but of a joy I had not expected to find again at 62. "Then it's settled," I whispered. 2 days later, James moved his belongings from room 12 into the owner's suite I had been occupying, the large corner room that had once been Eleanor's. We hung the portrait from 1978 on the wall opposite the bed, a reminder of our beginning. That night, as we lay together in the darkness listening to the distant sound of waves, James whispered, "I never thought I'd get the chance to grow old with you." I turned toward him, finding his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "We've already grown old," I reminded him with a smile, "but we can finish the journey together." He pulled me closer, and I rested my head on his shoulder, marveling at how right it felt to be here with him. As if the universe had finally corrected a long-standing error. "I love you, Katherine," he said simply. "I never stopped." "I love you too," I replied, the words both a confession and a homecoming. We have a second act after all. Chapter 7. Full circle. A year passed, then 2. Seacliff Inn flourished under our joint care, gaining a reputation for its artistic atmosphere, excellent breakfasts, and the love story that had become part of its legend. Guests often requested the Artist Suite, formerly Room 8, where James had hung a selection of his paintings and where, if asked, we would share parts of our story. James continued to paint, his work taking on new dimensions inspired by our reconnection. He created a series called Second Chances that became his most acclaimed work yet, depicting moments of reunion and renewal. The centerpiece was a large canvas showing 2 elderly lovers walking along the cliffs at sunset, facing forward rather than looking back. Michael and his family visited each summer, and my grandchildren grew close to James, calling him Grandpa J and delighting in the art lessons he gave them in the boathouse studio. Even James's former students and protégés became extended family, joining us for holidays and special occasions. We married on my 65th birthday, a simple ceremony on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, with our merged families as witnesses. James wore a blue suit that matched his eyes, and I carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the inn's gardens. Our vows were brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the winding path that had brought us together again. Life wasn't perfect, of course. We both had health concerns typical of our age. We disagreed about inn management decisions, about how much to work as we grew older, about whether to expand or maintain what we had. But each disagreement was tempered by the awareness of how precious our time together was, a gift neither of us had expected to receive. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death each year, we visited her grave in the small oceanside cemetery, bringing flowers and sharing with her the latest news of Seacliff. She's the reason we found each other again, I reminded James as we stood before her headstone on the 3rd such anniversary. She never gave up on us. Eleanor always believed in love stories, James agreed, his arm around my waist, even improbable ones. As we walked back to our car, James paused suddenly, reaching into his pocket. I almost forgot. I have something for you. He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a locket, antique silver with delicate engravings. Open it, he urged. I carefully unlatched the locket to find a miniature painting inside, no larger than a postage stamp, but exquisitely detailed. It showed the Seacliff Inn on one side and a tiny portrait of us on the other, standing on the porch, exactly as we were now. How did you do this? I asked, amazed at the intricacy of the work. Very small brushes and a lot of patience, he said with a smile. Turn it over. On the back was an inscription, Katherine and James, the best stories have no ending. I closed my hand around the locket, overcome with emotion. Thank you, I whispered, for this, for everything. As we drove back to the inn, to our home, I reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought us here. If my mother hadn't intercepted those letters, if Eleanor hadn't left me the inn, if I hadn't found the courage to return to Oceanside, so many moments where our paths might have diverged permanently. Yet here we were, in our 70s, with silver hair and lined faces, still finding new ways to love each other, still creating a life together. It wasn't the life I had expected, nor was it the one James had imagined during those long years of waiting. It was something different, something tempered by time and loss, but also deepened by the wisdom we had gained apart. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the ocean, a young couple approached from the garden. They were staying in room 8, celebrating their engagement. "We heard about your story from one of the other guests," the young woman said shyly. "How you found each other again after so many years. It's so romantic." James and I exchanged a glance, our hands automatically finding each other's. "Would you tell us," the young man asked, "how it happened?" So we did. We told them about that long-ago summer, about the misunderstandings and lost years, about Eleanor's final gift bringing us back together. We told them about second chances and the patience love sometimes requires. As they listened, rapt, I saw James studying them with an artist's eye, perhaps already planning a new painting, another moment captured for posterity. "The most important thing," I told the young couple as they prepared to return to their room, "is to never take love for granted. It's both stronger and more fragile than you can imagine." After they left, James and I remained on the porch as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly. "The years we lost?" I considered the question carefully. I regret the reason for those years apart, my mother's interference, our mutual silence. But I don't regret the lives we lived in between. I loved Robert. I treasure my son. You've created beautiful art and mentored countless students. We became the people we are now, the people who found each other again." James nodded, understanding. "Everything in its time," he said, quoting a phrase Eleanor had been fond of using. "Yes," I agreed, "everything in its time." As moonlight silvered the water and night settled around the inn, I leaned my head against James's shoulder, grateful for this unexpected chapter of my life, a chapter that had begun with an inheritance I didn't want and had become the greatest gift I could have received. Eleanor had known what she was doing all along. In leaving me Seacliff Inn, she hadn't just given me property. She had given me a way home, to the love that had been waiting for me all these years.